Our next guest is Ibiza landscape gardener extraordinaire, Jason Watson-Todd, co-founder of Terra Vita. Jason grew up on Ibiza, but studied his passion for the land overseas before coming back to live here full-time and raise his family of 4 girls. Terra Vita is a creative design studio focusing on landscape architecture, interior design and architecture. Jason, welcome to the Amar La Tierra podcast.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for bringing me here to this beautiful spot in Lleo, which I think we never would have found without the help of somebody who's been living here all their lives.
This has always been one of my favourite little getaway areas to connect with the sea and just to chill out and to relax and to contemplate.
I gather your parents arrived here in 1969 and were the founders of the Las Dahlias hippie market. What was it like growing up here as a child?
Absolutely and totally wild. It was a truly unique childhood. I'm actually at a loss for words as to how I can explain how special it was. It was an era where there was this fusion of, let's say, the new world and the old world. So when my parents came here, I think there was one paved road on the island, and everybody was pretty much still going around in donkeys and carts and things like that. No one had any electricity, there was no running water, but there was a real beautiful vibe, at least from what my mum explained to me in those days, of this coming together of the old world and the new world in that sense. And I had the privilege of of playing part of that, especially towards the end of it, let's say. So yeah, my childhood was how can I explain this? It was, let's say, I was brought in my home. We had no electricity. We had no running water. There was very little food in those days. But it was everybody was really happy. Everybody would help each other out. There was that big sense of community on a kind of extended family. Obviously there was no mobile phones, there was no phones, and you'd tend to, if you wanted to meet people, you'd go to their house, and if they weren't there was usually like a pen and pencil on the door, and you'd leave like a little note. The doors were always open, so you could open the house, go in, make yourself a cup of tea, sit down on the sofa, leave a note and say, I'll come back in a couple of days, or something like that. Or if there was someone there, you would quite often spend 2 or 3 days there. It was kind of common practice. And our parents were, it's kind of, to think about doing these things in this day and age, it jogs your mind. But just to give you an example, I remember going off camping with my friends, 4 or 5 friends of mine. I think we were 9 years old, and going camping by ourselves, and getting all our kit and just trudging off down the Camino and saying to our parents, "Hey, we'll be back in a couple of days," and then waving to us, and off we go, and literally disappear for a couple of days and camp on the beach and fish and doing some fishing and things like that. And those memories, it's like gold dust. It was very raw, very authentic, very kind of human, very down to earth. And there was, let's say, this fear culture that we have in this day and age. It just literally didn't exist. There was such a sense of community, and like I said earlier on, this kind of extended family that everybody would help everybody out. And in those days, I think there was one couple or some parents that I knew of that had a decent car. Everybody else had a banger. I remember, for example, my mum's car, which was a Renault 4. It was so old that in the back seat, the floor had rusted. And so we had a bit of wood on there. So at times I'd lift the bit of wood up, and I could see the dirt track kind of as my mum was driving along, and things like the door would fall off and things like that. But yeah, immensely grateful for being born on this island and being bred here. And grateful to my parents to have the courage to actually come here. They came here, and like I said earlier on, in 1969. They actually came on a sailing trip, and their plan wasn't to stay on the island. They just fell in love with the island, and never left. My mum's now, she's 84 years old. She's the co-founder of the Las Dalias hippie market. I think it was founded in 1983, and I remember having my own little store where I would sell my comic magazines and whatever I could find to make a couple of pennies, and that was great fun as well, because that was like the Las Dalias hippie market was also a kind of a melting pot for all the local foreigners from the island to come and to be able to make a living. And they would, let's say, work 3 or 4 months of the year, and then the rest of the year they wouldn't do much really.
So how did you create that or cultivate that connection to the land? Was it those wild camping trips that kind of, enabled you to kind of see the beauty and feel that sort of sensation, I guess, of like, being more close to nature?
Yeah, I think it was just being so close to nature in the sense of going camping, or just I'd walk all over the place in those days, or hitchhike. So it was very common to kind of walk through forests and walk along the coast to get from one area to the next. And I suppose that over the years of my early childhood of observing nature, observing the trees, the landscape, the sea, and all of that must have had a deep impact on me. And from there, my kind of passion arose to create beautiful landscape designs and to focus on that fusion of, let's say, landscape architecture or architecture with nature. So kind of creating a greener world, things like that.
What is it about Ibiza's flora and fauna, or in the Balearics in general, that's just so unique as opposed to other places that you've been?
Good question. I think when I was... So I left Ibiza when I was 11, and I spent 10 years in England, and then came back permanently. But I would come back every summer, and I always remember that distinct feeling of when I'd step off the plane, you get that kind of that waft of the kind of the Mediterranean pine trees, which really has that unique smell. And then Ibiza's just, it's rolling hills. It's very feminine in that side, and that let's say that contrast between spring and summer, where spring everything kind of sprouts back to life, and you've got all these flowers and orchids and an immense kind of array of wildflowers, and then as it gets hotter, it kind of dies back, and you get that arid kind of red clay soil, which is beautiful, that contrast. I think the Mediterranean, especially in Ibiza, you have those contrasts of that real kind of a classic, slightly arid Mediterranean landscape, and then at the same time it can spring back to life with a couple of drops of rain.
What is it that makes the land so red here? I mean, millions of people have asked me this question. I'm sure you could explain it way better than I ever could.
That's a good question. I mean, there's all sorts of theories behind there. There's even kind of spiritual theories, and
I'm sure there's plenty.
Yeah, there's plenty on that side. But the exact composition as to why the clay soil here is red, I actually don't know that. But I do know some stories about, which we won't go into, but why the soil is supposedly red.
Mother Nature is bleeding, her bleeding heart. I mean, obviously we see a lot of spraying happening here through the winter time and various other junctures across the year. And I think it'd be very interesting to hear from your perspective. Obviously we hear about these deadly caterpillars and many other things besides. What is it? What are they spraying? I mean, we're not talking to the chemtrails either, and the stories about those either.
I think, globalization has its its positive aspects and its negative aspects. And one of the negative aspects has been, let's say, the importation of, for example, olive trees or certain palm trees. By importing palm trees from, I think it was from Morocco, there's a red weevil that actually somehow made its way from Asia, and there's no natural predator. There's nothing that can control it, and that red weevil will actually eat into the heart of the palm. And the only way you can control it is by spraying, and it's spraying insecticides on 3 or 4 times a year, and there's no natural predator for that. And for example, in relation to the olive trees, by importing olive trees, since there wasn't a proper quarantine control initially, somehow in some of the olive trees, some snakes managed to kind of make their way into the trunk of the olive trees and then make their way to Ibiza. And now we have a problem, sadly, in relation to that, where we have well, it's quite a big problem actually in relation to the olive tree, in relation to the snakes that are, well, they're everywhere now, and it's very difficult to control that.
I mean, they're obviously a massive threat to the geckos and various other ecosystems. Like, what are the ecosystems that maybe need a little bit more protection?
Well, they're a big threat to, let's say, the local wildlife, especially lizards. Geckos, not so much, but lizards have definitely had a hard time, and I've really noticed that. I remember even 10 years ago, you'd go to the beach and you couldn't even put your sandwich down because there would be like 100 lizards eating away at it. And now you're lucky if you see 1 or 2. So that's it. Yeah, it's very sad and a big problem, and there's not really a solution. So I think sometimes we seem very wise and very intelligent creatures, but on the other end of the spectrum, we're quite silly with the way we take care of nature and the kind of this general lack of respect for her. It's not good.
I think that's a very important subject, doing the kind of work that you do in landscape design and architecture design. I think, there's so many people that come here with, as you said, wishes for a palm tree, but bringing plants that aren't indigenous to the island, I suppose, is the number one way that these kind of problems arise, because they breed, imbalance within the natural flora and fauna.
That's a great question, and this is where I have to strike the balance with what a client wishes and at the same time to kind of guide them to make wise decisions. So in relation to palms, I will always suggest the local date palm and not go for other types of palms, because a local date palm obviously is it's much easier for it to adapt to Ibiza, and it has less problems with kind of diseases and bugs and things like that. And with the olive trees, I would say that best to plant olive trees, but if you are going to import them, to import them at the right time of year, because there's certain times of years where the snakes don't hibernate, and that's when you can actually import them. Which is that way you avoid importing, let's say, more hidden snakes within the trunk of a pine of an olive tree.
Have you ever seen a snake?
Yes, quite a few. Yeah. I don't really like snakes very much.
Me either. I hear that you also work with a biologist on the land that kind of protects and encourages certain types of wildlife to enter the garden and perhaps be present around the homes of the people that you work with. And I just wonder, one of the things that I heard that you have been installing homes for bats. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's a great question. Well, just to emphasize a little bit more on the design team, we have biologists, we have landscape architects, interior designers, artists, and so on. And they all work, and biologists, and they all work together as a team and focus on a biophilic approach. So let's say biophilia is this fusion between nature and architecture. So we will, in this case, Christina, who's our biologist, she will do the research into if it's possible to have bat homes in the particular location that the house is set. and a bat will eat, I think, around 2,000 mosquitoes a night. So it's a great way of controlling your mosquitoes instead of spraying, because a lot of people just basically spray chemicals all over the place and don't just kill the mosquitoes, they kill everything else. So it's a bit silly. And if you can incorporate, let's say, bat homes, and that's a wonderful way of helping nature. And we also make hedgehog houses, and hedgehogs are the only natural predator that will eat snakes. Obviously, when the snakes are small, but they'll gobble them up. So it's another way of controlling snakes.
Newfound respect for those little hedgehogs.
Yeah, I love hedgehogs. It's very cute little creatures, especially when you see their faces and their little snouts. You kind of want to hug them, but you can't do it. You'll end up with spikes all over your hand.
Have you been to Can Hog, the sanctuary?
Yes. That's near between Santa Eulalia and San Carlos, I think. Yes. Yeah. It's a great place. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I think we should probably have a little whip round for those guys at some point on this podcast, because I think they need some extra support, and the work that they do is really amazing.
It's amazing, yeah. Hats off to them.
So apart from eating snakes, what else do hedgehogs add to a garden?
Well, they'll eat snails, which is good, because then your snails don't, eat your lettuces and things like that. It's just kind of trying to find that balance. I think that's the best way. Obviously, the best way is just to let nature do its thing and not intervene. But if you're building a home, you have to you have to have that balance of, let's say you need electricity. So if you need electricity, the best way of providing electricity is using solar power, if that's possible. Things like that. It's just trying to be coherent and as respectful as possible to the environment, and always kind of focus on creating a greener world.
I mean, this all grew, if you'll excuse the pun, from your first tender age of 18 when you were tending to a loving tomato. Is this story true?
Well, I think that was when I was in Bath, actually, and I really needed to find some way of being in contact with nature. So I created this little rooftop garden, which was literally, I had to clamber through a window, and I had a couple of pots where I was growing some tomatoes and carrots and things like that. And it's immensely satisfying. Planting your seed, nurturing it, and then suddenly you've got a tomato, and you can actually bite into it, and you've actually being part of its process, its growth, and then you can kind of reap those rewards in a simple manner, just by eating the tomatoes. It's wonderful.
I mean, you have a veggie patch now, right, in your garden?
Yes, I have quite a large veggie patch, and I have wild chickens as well that kind of roam all over the garden, and that's where I have to strike the balance, because they do crap everywhere. But they do keep the garden in check with little bugs and things like that, and it's so beautiful to see them just strolling around the garden, and they each one of them has their character. So when I go for a walk, they'll all follow me because they think I'm going to feed them. So.
So you're one of these annoying neighbours that are creating these cock-a-doodle-doos and the ungodly hour of the morning that I have them at my house.
Basically, yeah. Yeah, they start singing it as soon as the sun rises around 5:30. They start making their noise. If you're not used to it, it can be a bit annoying initially, but then after that, it's actually really pleasant, and they just wake you up nice and early, and you can sleep through it if you want. You get used to it.
I definitely haven't mastered that art yet. It's something I'm working on for sure. I mean, lastly, what's the number one thing that you see in nature that you think perhaps has taught you some kind of lesson through the years? Well, what have you learned from nature and working so connected to the land?
Patience, I think, is just observing her, honouring her, and just seeing the miracle that nature is. Its creation in all senses. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And if you're able to be present, to stand still and just have a peek at just a flower and look at it consciously, it's an absolute miracle.
Well, I look forward to hearing more about your work and also your zero carbon house that you have built on the island. I think that's definitely the future, not just of the land, but also the building work that people do on Ibiza. And I'm very much looking forward to having that conversation later in the series. Thank you so much for bringing us here to Puda's Lleo.
Pleasure. Thank you.